Hi, and welcome back to the Pink Shelves. I'm Rose, and I just got back from an 8-day road trip out west, and I would like to talk about the books that I read while I was out there. I didn't end up reading as much on this 8-day road trip as you might have expected me to, considering that I was in the car from 3 to 8 hours every day, simply because I did not realize how much reading I could get done when there was nothing else to do. It's been a long time since I haven't had access to a phone, and my only method of entertainment has been a book. And so I kind of forgot how much reading you can get done in those circumstances. I also didn't fully comprehend how much driving was actually going to be involved until I was doing it. All of that came out to mean that I had to rely more on downloaded music than books because I was trying to make my books stretch over the whole trip. Now, I will say there were 2 books I brought that I did not read. One because I meant to bring a certain one in a series and then accidentally brought a different one that I had already read quite recently, so there was really no desire for me to read that again so soon, especially since I'm not particularly into rereading books right now. I'm trying really hard not to do any rereads until I have finished the books that I haven't read yet. And also because I wanted to read a different one in that series, so I wasn't in the mood for that book at all, even if I had wanted to reread it. The second one, it was simply that it was a graphic novel, and for some reason, graphic novels are harder for me to concentrate on than any other kind of book. I know that that might be odd. I know that a lot of people find it easier. I think maybe because I'm trying to process words and pictures at the same time, often with very little context, since I don't follow comic storylines due to not really having a comic book store close to where I live. All of that to say, I was never in the mood to read that one because I just was too exhausted the whole time to get into that. So I didn't read that one either. However, I did read the other books I brought. And at the end of this video, I am going to discuss the books that I received while I was there. There are only 2 of them. I was a very good girl, and I only acquired 2 books, despite many opportunities to get more. But let us get started. The first book that I read while I was there was a young adult fantasy novel called Daughter of the Pirate King. I almost said Queen because the sequel has Queen in the title, and I always get them mixed up. But I wanted to read this book back when I was only reading young adult books, back when I first read like Divergent and The Hunger Games, etc., etc. I really wanted to read this book, and my library didn't have it. And at that time, I was really only reading stuff I got from the library, so I didn't end up reading it, and I always ended up picking other things. I never got to it. Finally, I believe it was earlier this year or perhaps sometime last year, I finally decided to purchase it because I do still read some young adult and read it. And I finally got around to it on this trip because I knew I'd be able to read it quickly because of the length of the book that it was, and because I needed sort of a brain break from reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I probably will make a separate video on at some point. Basically, I finished that trilogy. I read a very short romance novel, and then the next thing I read was a young adult fantasy to sort of ease back in to more mature stuff so that I could then read The Hobbit, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the Daughter of the Pirate King was very good. You could definitely tell in some respects that it was young adult. In other respects, I would never have recommended it to any of the young adult readers that I know. However, most of them are have very strict parameters about what they're comfortable with. I know that not all young adult readers are like that. Me personally, when I was reading young adult books, I was on the lower end of the young adult demographic, so I would have been too young for this book. There is a lot of suggestive scenes in this. I wouldn't say that there's anything explicit, but it's there, and that's the author's prerogative. But I would not have recommended it to a young me, and I wouldn't recommend it to, any of those people that I know. However, I would recommend this to other people. I would recommend this to other people who enjoy young adult, but often feel like the stakes are a little too low. I would recommend this to people that were okay with how intense the Hunger Games were, but prefer fantasy if they were a young adult reader. It's definitely very obviously young adult in other respects. However, like for instance, there's a lot of cliches because of when it was written and who it was written for. Now, cliches are popular for a reason, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. I knew going into it that it would probably be that way. There was a little bit of just unbelievability around how old the characters were. Now, people have talked about this time and time again concerning young adult stories and stories that feature young adults, even if they are not marketed towards people of the same age, that these characters are 17 years old and they're pirate captains. I don't actually know enough about the history of pirates to know if that is super accurate or not. I do believe that potentially, from what I know about history, very young people accomplished great feats of leadership all the time. So perhaps, and in fact probably, there was a case or 7 of younger people being pirate captains or first mates or whatever. In this world, however, because I would point out that as far as I can tell, this is not our world, it is a fantasy world. In this world, it was made abundantly clear that it's kind of not really a world built around people doing things at a young age. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I haven't read the sequel. There wasn't a lot of world building in general, but the vibe I got was generally that all of the other people outside of the main characters are doing pirate stuff, for lack of better terminology, at a perfectly normal expected age. Like they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, what have you, or at the very least their late 20s. Now, for some of the characters, it did make sense that they were that young and doing it, particularly the main character and the love interest. There were reasons, like, yes, okay, she's the daughter of the Pirate King, so yes, she would be a captain at 17, perhaps because of that. However, there was just an air of unbelievability about it, mostly because the skill set that she had, I'm not positive that she could gain it by that age. I'm just not. I don't know. I could be totally wrong about all of this, but I'm not positive that it's believable that the characters are the people that they are by 17, 18 years old. I'm saying this as someone who is around that age range and who knows a lot of people who are around that age range, that it just becomes less believable for characters to do stuff like this at those ages as time goes on. That said, I really enjoyed this book. It was one of those, and I run into this a lot, where I kind of wished I could have read it earlier. I wish I could have read it when I was 14, because I would have loved it then. I'm older now, and I can see the flaws in it more, and it kind of itches at me while I'm reading it or thinking about it, that now I have read older stuff, or quote-unquote better stuff. Obviously, literature is subjective. And I just think that the craze for that has passed. I wish that the version of me that was still really obsessed with, like, Pirates of the Caribbean and young adult material in general could have read this book. I think I would have loved it then. The parts of me that are still the same as they were then, love it now. But there are a lot of parts of me that just kind of was unimpressed. And I knew that going in. I knew going in that the main character was not really going to be a female Jack Sparrow like the blurb promised. She's just a girl who's a pirate. She has no similarities to Jack. I knew that because I've run into it enough now. But Daughter of the Pirate King was decently good, and I would recommend it to select people. I would say check it out if you like young adult fantasy. So, moving on. Before I move on to The Hobbit, I do want to take a minute to acknowledge the fact that I don't look as dolled up as I usually try to for my videos because I was traveling today, and I'm very tired, and I didn't feel like getting dolled up, so I look a little bit cozy instead. And I honestly think it's somewhat fitting because I will now be talking about The Hobbit. And personally, I think that if Bilbo Baggins had a YouTube channel, he would prefer to do videos in a housecoat with freshly washed hair, especially if he had just returned from his unexpected journey. Now that that's out of the way, let's segue into talking about The Hobbit. I read the entirety of The Hobbit while on my road trip. It was incredible, by the way, to read The Hobbit, which is a story about traveling through the mountains and the forests while actually in the mountains and the forests out west. That was very cool. What made it even cooler was that I chose to listen to the Rings of Power soundtrack while doing that. And so it just all was a great atmosphere that kind of came together perfectly. I know that some people probably won't like that I chose not to listen to the Hobbit soundtrack, or at least the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, but I didn't have those downloaded and my phone lost signal, so I had to use the closest thing that I had downloaded. So don't flame me, please, as they would say, but let's actually talk about The Hobbit and what I liked and disliked about The Hobbit. First of all, I'd like to say Tolkien is the father of all modern fantasy for a reason, and that legacy began with The Hobbit. If he had never written The Hobbit, basically literature as we know it, cinema and poetry and myth and perhaps a bunch of other things that we don't even think of when talking about this, like perhaps music or fashion or acting or what have you, would be drastically different if The Hobbit was never written and published. Because The Hobbit is a classic for a reason. Going into The Hobbit, I expected it to be good, but I did not expect to enjoy it. Mostly because I was always told it was harder to read than Lord of the Rings. It was drastically different from the movies, and that it would not set well with someone who was a fan of Lord of the Rings, and I am a great fan of Lord of the Rings, the books and the movies. So I was a little bit hesitant, but I did end up loving it, even though I was afraid of the differences between the books and the movies. Not because I really like the movies. Actually, I've never liked the movies, and I can't sit through them to save my life. I'm going to try to watch them again now, but I've never been able to really before. I have seen them, but only once. And I was sort of afraid, actually, that the differences would only serve to make it kind of disconcerting, like remembering a deja vu event the wrong way. However, that was not so because I actually didn't notice the differences very much. Obviously, the most noticeable one is the whole Elven storyline not really being present, other than the Elven King being in the story. It's not there. They don't say Thranduil's name. Legolas is not there. Tauriel does not exist. Therefore, Keely's storyline doesn't happen, and there's a myriad of other things that avalanche out of that. But I knew all of that already, so that would have been the only confusing part, I think. I think that all the other differences are smaller things from the movies that I probably just forgot about because I've only seen them once and it was years ago. So, what did I actually like about the book? It was actually far easier to read, for me at least, than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It was very comforting, it was fantastical, it was so easy to visualize, and it made it so clear why it is as famous as it is. I think that book is one of my favorites ever now. I wouldn't rank it above Lord of the Rings trilogy just because of personal tastes, and because they're vastly different books, actually. But I truly loved The Hobbit. I felt like it was so colorful and warm, and it was very relatable, actually. Mostly because I don't travel well, so Bilbo's inner monologue while he's traveling reluctantly through the mountains was kind of the same as mine while I was traveling through the mountains, because I don't like to travel, but I did enjoy seeing the mountains. I did benefit from that trip, just as Bilbo benefited from his journey. So it was a nice thing to sort of read while experiencing like a very teeny tiny miniature version of the plot of the novel. Um, I was very saddened at the end, uh, and I did not expect to be, because in the movie, I didn't really care what happened at the end because I didn't really like the movies. The book is not necessarily better than the movie, but just very, very different. I think the movie is a lot more grimdark, as they call it, and the book is a happier tale. It's a children's book. It was a bedtime story. It was a ray of hope that Tolkien created after this horrible war that himself and so many people around him had been through. I will probably read The Hobbit again. I want to get a new copy because the copy I had is secondhand, so it's kind of worn out. I'd like to get a new one and maybe highlight and tab some things because I didn't do that with The Hobbit like I did with the first two Lord of the Rings books. But all in all, wonderful read. And the only thing is, like, I did actually miss having Legolas and Toriel in the story. I know that that's controversial to say, but I think it's just because that was the only part of the movies that I liked, and Legolas is one of my favorite characters of all time. So I did miss him. I missed the elven side of things in general, but I felt like for those to be in the novel would have ruined the atmosphere of it. So I don't wish that they were in the novel at all. I just sort of feel keenly the nuance of understanding that I enjoyed that part in the movie and I enjoyed everything else about the book, and there's no way to put them together. So it's an interesting feeling. But that is my opinion on The Hobbit, and now I will move on to the one that I actually read in between those two, because it was technically an audiobook, so I really listened to it. So actually, I am going to take a break now because I think my family is home, which means it is time for me to watch the new episode of The Summer I Turned Pretty with my mommy, and I'm very excited to do so. So I will be back to talk about the next book that I read and the books that I acquired. And I might even talk about the books that I'm planning to read in future. Hi, a little note from editing. I just realized that in the upcoming segment of the video, I completely forgot to say the name of the book that I'm talking about. The book is called Friends with Words, Adventures in Language Land by Martha Barnett. All right, carry on. All right, I am back and I'm ready to talk about the other book that I read while on my road trip. As I mentioned previously, that book was an audiobook, so I technically didn't read it, hence the air quotes. I listened to it. I don't want anyone to get up in arms about me saying that I read an audiobook. I listened to the audiobook, but I also put air quotes around that because it was a 10-hour audiobook, and by the time I left for my trip, there were only about 3 hours left. So I knocked it out in one 4.5-hour drive and then proceeded to do other stuff for the rest of the time. So I can't really honestly say, obviously, that I didn't read the full book, listen to the full book while I was on my road trip. However, I would say that the part that I listened to while on my road trip was one of the most beneficial parts of the book. And this is the thing that I ran into with this book. I came to understand it by revisiting the description, the synopsis of the book. It was a nonfiction book, that it was apparently dual, and it was supposed to be an autobiography of the author's life intermixed with random fun facts about her career. Her career being in linguistics and radio show hosting, and I was very interested in both of those things, but I understood it originally that the book would be sort of a collection of all of her linguistic knowledge that she had used for her word-themed radio show, and apparently I just didn't read the synopsis correctly the first time that I read it. Because if I had, I would have known that it was more of like an autobiography interspersed with fun facts. And then I could have picked a different book on linguistics. I did come away with a lot of really fun facts. I just don't feel like I didn't get what I wanted. I got useful knowledge, but what I wanted was a more detailed description of like a timeline of how language has evolved. I wanted something very detailed and in-depth. And this wasn't really that. This was more one-off sentences about, like, this is where we get this turn of phrase, this is where this word comes from. There were some, like, lengthier stories, like, in the beginning of the book. There were, like, entire chapters dedicated to where specific, like, words and phrases come from. And then as the book went on, however, that completely stopped, and it became just fun facts about slang, uh, instead of, like, in-depth information about, like, how linguistics has evolved. And when it wasn't that, it was autobiographical material. So I'm not going to criticize the amount of autobiographical material because it's on me that I didn't notice that there was going to be so much of that when I first started it. However, I will criticize that I feel like it's a little bit misleading and doesn't bode well for continuity, that the book starts with such in-depth knowledge about these, like, actual well-entrenched centuries old things that we say and words that we have, and then suddenly, about, like, a quarter of the way into the book, it's like a freeze frame record scratch, and all we talk about from then on out, literally all we talk about, is slang. And not even and if it was in depth about slang, that would be fascinating. And it was, the parts that I got was fascinating. I am not an elitist in terms of linguistics. I find slang fascinating. I use slang myself. I've probably used it in these long form videos because it's a part of our speech. Slang is a part of culture. Culture is a part of speech. And speech is a part of slang, etc., etc. It's a circle. I understand that. However, it wasn't an in-depth account of slang. It was literally just rapid fire. In this state, we say this because this. In this state, we say this because this. In this country, we say this because this. Speaking of countries, only like 10 times maybe in most of this book did we ever really go outside the US. Now, I understand the author was American, but again, if you were going to make the whole, like, last 3/4 of the book be about slang, it should have at least been more in depth, and it should have covered more ground than just, like, the Bible Belt in the United States. She didn't really go into, like, non-Southern or Appalachian places, which I suppose I understand why. Her background was very Southern and Appalachian. You can say it either way. But it was just frustrating because that part I felt like was a little bit weird because, number one, it wasn't like that at the get-go. It changed, and there was really no explanation. And number two, it just didn't give enough information to really be worth it. When you're devoting that many hours to it, it's like, yeah, I got a bunch of fun facts, but also I could have probably just pulled up someone on any sort of social media platform and watched, like, a bunch of different shorts of them telling me all of this stuff. If I wanted to not use the internet for it, I could have just looked up the woman's radio show that she hosts that is, I believe, still active, and even if it's not, as I understand it, the episodes and such are still available. So it just wasn't really worth my time in the end of it. And this is kind of similar to, I didn't talk about this book because I wasn't really making long form videos talking about books yet, but I read, like, an autobiography that was written of ABBA, and I kind of felt this way too, that it gave me a lot of really fun facts about ABBA, but it did not tell me the story of ABBA. So now I have all of these fun facts about slang and, like, 2 in-depth stories about isolated single sentences in terms of linguistics, but I don't have in-depth anything. I don't have any in-depth knowledge that I took away from this. Now, it's fine to not want in-depth language. If you only want fun facts about slang, about linguistics, about this person's life, that's completely fine, and I recommend this book to you. And for that reason, I did benefit a little bit from getting that information, but I have to say that as someone that was really looking for more from this the fact that it started as like really detailed, in-depth and heartfelt, and then just became rapid fire accounts of slang being used in like a good 45% of the United States. I mean, half of this stuff like I already knew people said. And also it was kind of aggravating because there was a lot of I'm not going to share where I'm from, but there was a lot of things where she would say, in this state, we'll use Texas, and, in Texas they say this, and it's so amazing because they don't say this anywhere else in the United States, and I know this because I'm a linguist. And it's like, I have grown up saying that, and I have grown up hearing it, and I do not live anywhere near Texas. This kept happening with multiple places that I don't live anywhere near. And then the one time that she did mention the place that I'm from, I had never heard the thing that she referenced. Now I understand that it could have just been something that's from a different area than I'm from, or that I have not been aware of, or that I heard as a child and then don't remember now. But it just was aggravating. So points, I guess, for it being she had a very interesting life story that was interesting to hear about, and getting fun facts about slang. But the flow of the book was not good, and it didn't actually give me very much information, and a couple things were blatantly inaccurate. Either it was, something that she exaggerated, or sort of under researched, because definitely these things are said in other places. That thing has never been said, things like that. So that it makes me a little bit hesitant to recommend it to anyone. But if it sounds like you would like it based on the benefits I said it had, feel free. Now that I am done discussing Friends with Words, at least for now, we can come to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, as it were, where I tell you the two books that I acquired while I was on my road trip. I absolutely love acquiring new books, so I was super excited, and I was also excited that it was only two. And I was excited for other reasons as well, but those would be spoilers for what I'm about to talk about, so I am going to hold that thought, put a pin in it, and tell you in a minute. What I will say is that usually, if you've seen my videos before at all, you may have noticed that I usually hold up the book I'm talking about in my hands while I'm talking about it. However, I have noticed that I tend to speak less eloquently while doing that because I tend to mess with the book while I'm holding it, which causes my thoughts to get away from me. So I chose not to do that this time. So I'm not going to hold them up for you. I hope that is okay. I am just going to tell you what they were, if I can remember, because I am so tired. I think I may have forgotten the title of one of them, but let's go on. So the first book that I acquired, I was excited about for numerous reasons, and I will tell you all of them after I tell you that it is The Mysterious Benedict Society, The Riddle of Ages. It is the last book in the series, The Mysterious Benedict Society, at least to my knowledge. I say that because originally The Mysterious Benedict Society was a trilogy, and then years later, the fourth one was released, and I was very surprised because I did not know about it until well after it came out. So I would not be surprised if another one had come out since then that I somehow don't know about, and I may actually look that up after this. But there is also a prequel and a special work puzzle book, which has some added content in it. The reason why I know this is because I have owned those 5 books for years. I originally, when I was in 3rd grade, I had that book read to me and my class by a teacher, and it quickly became my favorite book, but she ended up retiring before she could finish reading us that book, and I was very upset. However, I then later received the book series as a gift from my family. And I read that book series and did that workbook so many times. It was honestly unbelievable. Like, I think there are still parts of it that I have utterly memorized. It was my favorite. It was my favorite thing ever. And then, like 2 or 3 years later, I was at the library just browsing, not really intending to get anything, and I came across a new book, and I was so shocked because I had no idea that it had come out with a new book. I read it only once and I returned it to the library, and I never got around to buying that book because I never saw it for sale anywhere. And a lot of times I don't go looking for books that I've already read to buy. I only buy them if I happen to see them somewhere for an affordable price, because it feels silly to make an effort to get a book that you've already read, I guess, from my perspective. Um, but while we were on our trip, we found this darling little coffee shop with a bookstore inside of it. And I was determined not to buy a book for reasons that I'll talk about some other time. And then I went into the children's section, and I had told myself the only way that I could buy a book was if it was a book that I had already read but did not own, or a book that I owned but needed a new copy of due to damage. Those were my options. I found this book. It was the only copy, and it was only $10, which is impressive, nowadays. And I was thrilled because I actually had, obviously the money to get it. So I bought the book, and I have not regretted it. I'm very excited. I actually haven't taken it out of the bag they gave it to me in yet, because it's in like such pristine condition, and my other Mysterious Benedict Societies are obviously like worn out because of how many times I read them. So it's weird to see one like perfect, because even the one I got from the library was used, so it was also worn out. And I haven't taken it out of the bag yet. It was also because I wanted it to be protected during traveling. I didn't want it to get like torn up or damaged or anything. So super excited about that. And maybe, when I have the time, I might do a reread, because I haven't read that series in a long time. It was my childhood favorite, and I would love to know if it stands the test of time. But I'm excited about that one, because of it being from that series, because I've been wanting to own it for so long, because it's in such good condition, because it was so cheap, and just simply because I love the serotonin burst I get from buying books. And then there's the other book that I acquired, and you may be wondering by now, like, why is she saying acquired? Well, the first reason is that I'm an absolute nerd who's read way too many books and says words like acquired instead of got. But the second reason is because I didn't actually buy the other book that I came home with. So every time I go on any sort of trip or vacation, even if it's only like a couple towns away, I find like one or two little free libraries. And then if I find something I want in them, I'm never able to trade, because I never bring an extra book with me on vacation or a trip or what have you. So I only ever have a book that I'm like currently reading, or that I don't want to get rid of for whatever reason. And it's always so frustrating. So, going this time, I have this whole giant stack of books that I'm trying to get rid of. So, I grabbed like the smallest one I could find, because I obviously didn't want it to take up too much space in my luggage. And I packed it, and I was like, this time, if I find a little free library, I'm going to trade, and I'm going to get something. And because I've never been able to do it before. And I'm so excited, because we made it the whole time, and I saw one the very first day, and it had nothing in it. Like, I mean, it had stuff in it, but nothing I wanted. It was all kind of like really outdated, like romance novels and encyclopedias. And I was kind of bummed, because I was like, the one time I actually bring something to trade, and then I'm not going to see any. Well, it was, I believe, like the one of the last days of the road trip. I know that we we were at our like last landmark that we were going to see, and we were in this hotel, and tucked into like the corner of the lobby was a little free library, and my family sent me a picture, and I ran, immediately left the hotel room where I was waiting, and I took my book that I was going to trade, and I went and I sat in front of the little free library, and they had good stuff. They had the Iliad, and as much as it hurt because this copy of the Iliad, it was a Penguin Classics copy, and obviously everybody goes feral for the Penguin Classics. But I already have a copy of the Iliad. Now, I would have taken it because I like to have multiple editions of like classic books. Um, and especially with the Iliad, it would have been a different translation from the one I have. However, on the shelf below that one was Beowulf, which is a classic that I do not have, and that I don't usually see in stores when I'm looking at like the classics section. So I was so excited, and it's such a cute copy too. Hopefully, I'll get to show it eventually, but I'm thrilled, and I traded, and that is the second book that I came home with. So I did not buy it, and that's why I feel the need to use the word acquired. Now, the reason why I'm excited about this is because although it is a book I have not read before, which adds to my to be read pile that is like a mile high, it was free. And it is a classic, so I believe it will be beneficial. I am a writer myself, so reading the classics is super important to me, especially because I haven't read like an ancient classic yet. So those were the books that I acquired, and I am very excited that I did so good, and I only got two. I only bought one of them. Yay! So that is the end of the books that I read on the road trip and the books that I acquired on the road trip. I unfortunately don't have anything else to talk about that pertains to this topic of discussion. I have a lot of ideas for other videos, but I don't want to muddy this one up by talking about any of the other things. What I can tell you is that I am planning tentatively on reading the sequel to Daughter of the Pirate King next. I'm a little hesitant because I'm trying not to read books that I don't already own right now, but if I was going to read it, I'll probably just get it on Libby, and make an exception because I'll probably read it very fast, and chances are I might be able to either read that one fast and then move on, or I can read it at the same time as perhaps another more difficult book, because at times when you're reading a really difficult book, it can be good to balance it out with something that is a little bit easier on your brain. Now, considering that the other book that I am wanting to read in the next couple of weeks is The Silmarillion, that's going to be necessary, most likely. I'm debating I might listen to the audiobook of The Silmarillion because I have heard that it's easier, but I also heard that The Hobbit was really hard to get through and that I should listen to the audiobook of that one, and I didn't find that to be the case. So I'm going to try the physical version, and then we'll see. And but that is all. So thank you very much if you have watched all this way, and I hope you have very happy travels. Bye.